September 1944. A lone American bomber tries something impossible. Enemy fighters close from behind, guns hot. The pilot drops his landing flaps at 200 miles per hour. His crew thinks he's lost his mind. The bomber pulls harder than it was ever designed to. The fighter overshoots, screams past, misses. No one was supposed to survive that maneuver. No manual authorized it, but it worked. His name was Harold Seidel, and the trick he discovered would rewrite the survival odds for hundreds of airmen over hostile Europe. The European theater, autumn of 1944. The air war had become a numbers game written in aluminum and fire. Every day, hundreds of bombers pushed deep into Germany. Their targets, oil refineries, rail hubs, factories that fed the Reich's war machine. Every day, fighters rose to meet them, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, fast and ruthless. The B-17 flying fortress was built to absorb punishment, heavy armor, 10 machine guns, formations so tight they created overlapping fields of fire. But it was not built to maneuver. It lumbered through the sky at 170 miles per hour, a straight line made of rivets and hope. The standard doctrine was simple. Hold formation. Trust your gunners. Trust the group. If a fighter came at you, you fired. If you broke formation, you died alone. And yet, bombers were still dying. Entire squadrons shredded over Brunswick, fireballs over Schweinfurt, parachutes blossoming over the Rhine like strange white flowers. The flak and the fighters were relentless. Doctrine said, stay together. Physics said you couldn't turn. Logic said you were already doing everything possible. But logic in war is only as good as the man interpreting it. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Harold Seidel was not a natural warrior. Born in rural Wisconsin, he grew up on a small farm where machinery was currency and improvisation was survival. Tractors broke down in spring planting season. You fixed them with what you had: wire, wrenches, willpower. If something didn't work the way it was supposed to, you figured out why. You didn't wait for an expert. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of person who watched more than he spoke. His hands knew engines before his mind knew theory. He understood tolerances, stresses, the way metal bent under load. He knew when a machine was being asked to do something it wasn't designed for, and sometimes he knew it could do it anyway. When the war came, Seidel enlisted. He trained as a pilot. Not a fighter jock chasing glory in a Mustang. A bomber pilot, 4 engines, 10 men depending on his decisions. A plane that weighed 30 tons and handled like a freight train. He was assigned to the 8th Air Force, stationed in England. The airfield was a grid of Nissen huts and oil-stained concrete, perpetually damp with North Sea fog. At night, you could hear the engines warming up for dawn missions. The sound carried for miles. A low, throbbing hum that rattled the windows of farmhouses and made the locals look up. Seidel flew his first combat mission in June. The flak was worse than training had prepared him for. Black puffs that appeared out of nowhere, shaking the plane like a fist. Shrapnel punched through the fuselage. One piece tore through the cockpit glass and embedded in the co-pilot's seat. 6 inches lower, and it would have killed him. The fighters came in at 10 o'clock high. Dots that became sharks. They rolled through the formation, guns sparking, then vanished back into the sun. The gunners fired until their barrels glowed. Spent casings piled ankle-deep on the floor. Seidel held his course, held his altitude, did exactly what doctrine required. They made it home, 18 holes in the fuselage, 1 engine trailing smoke, but alive. After the debriefing, Seidel stood on the hardstand and stared at the damage. He ran his hand along the torn aluminum. Someone had already chalked the mission tally on the nose. Another sortie survived. Another roll of the dice. He didn't feel lucky. He felt like a target, and he started thinking about what a B-17 could do if you stopped thinking of it as a fortress and started thinking of it as a machine. The impossible problem was this: how do you evade a fighter when you can't outrun it and can't outturn it? Every bomber crew faced it. The Focke-Wulf 190 could hit 400 miles per hour in a dive. The Messerschmitt 109 could climb like a rocket and turn inside anything bigger than a Spitfire. A B-17 at full throttle barely cracked 200. Standard evasive action was a joke, a shallow weaving pattern, a slight change in altitude. The theory was it disrupted the attacker's aim. The reality was it bought you seconds. Maybe. Some pilots tried steep banks. The plane shuddered and bled speed. Structural stress groaned through the airframe. You might dodge one pass. Then you were slow, alone, and falling behind the formation. Other fighters would smell it and circle back. A limping bomber was a magnet. Flight surgeons documented the problem in clinical language. Probability of survival decreased exponentially once separated from group defensive fire. Recommended action: maintain formation integrity at all costs. Engineers knew the B-17's limits. Maximum bank angle, 30 degrees before risk of stall. Flaps were for landing. Deployed above 140 miles per hour, they could rip off or buckle the wing. The manual was explicit. Do not extend flaps in high-speed flight. Do not exceed load factor limits. Do not attempt aerobatic maneuvers. No one questioned it. These were the laws written in wind tunnel data and test flights. You didn't break them. You couldn't. But Seidel had noticed something. On approach to the airfield, when you dropped the flaps and cut throttle, the nose pitched down hard. You had to pull back on the yoke to keep level. The plane wanted to rotate. The flaps didn't just add drag. They changed the center of lift. They gave you leverage. He thought about that. Late at night, lying in his bunk, staring at the curved ceiling of the hut. He thought about the way a crop duster turned at low speed by dumping flaps and hauling back. He thought about the way his uncle's biplane could pivot on a wingtip because it was slow and the controls had authority. What if you could give a B-17 that authority? Just for a few seconds. Just enough. It was a stupid idea. It violated everything he'd been taught. But it stayed with him. He didn't mention it at first. Not to his co-pilot, not to the squadron commander. It sounded insane. You're going to do what? Drop your flaps at cruise speed during a fighter attack? You'll rip the wings off. You'll stall. You'll kill everyone on board. But the idea wouldn't let go. So he started small. Subtle tests. On return flights, when the formation was breaking up and the danger had passed, he'd ease the flaps out a notch, just a few degrees. Feel how the plane responded. The nose dipped. The yoke got heavier. The airspeed bled off fast, but the plane didn't come apart. He did it again. A little more flap, a little more back pressure. The B-17 pitched and yawed, sluggish and angry, but it turned. Not gracefully, not smoothly, but tighter than it was supposed to. His co-pilot noticed, asked what he was doing. Seidel said he was testing the trim, checking control response. The co-pilot didn't push it. Seidel kept experimenting. He noted the altitude, the airspeed, the engine settings. He felt the flutter in the wings, the shudder through the controls. He was looking for the edge. The point where physics allowed something doctrine forbade, and then, in late September, he found it. They were over the Ruhr Valley. The flak had been heavy, but scattered. The bomb run was complete. They were turning for home when the fighters came. 2 Focke-Wulfs, diving out of a cloud bank at 4 o'clock. The ball turret gunner called them out. Seidel saw the tracers arcing toward them, bright little comets that floated up slow and then snapped past fast. One fighter committed, lined up, closed the distance. Seidel made a choice. He pulled the throttles back, reached for the flap lever, dropped them halfway. The plane bucked. The nose dropped like a stone. He hauled back on the yoke with both hands. The control column fought him. The plane groaned, metal shrieked, and the B-17 pivoted. Not a gentle bank, a wrenching, violent turn. The fighters screamed past their left wing, too fast, too close. The German pilot had misjudged the closure rate. He'd expected the bomber to stay predictable. Instead, it had done the impossible. It had turned inside him. The second fighter broke off. Didn't risk the same mistake. Seidel pulled the flaps back up, added power, leveled out. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were shaking, but they were alive. His co-pilot stared at him, mouth open, said nothing. Seidel didn't explain. Not yet. He was too busy running the numbers in his head. Flap setting, airspeed, angle of attack. All of it had worked. It shouldn't have, but it did. He'd just rewritten the manual. And no one else knew it yet. Word spread the way it always does in a combat squadron. Quietly, unofficially, over cigarettes and coffee in the debriefing hut. Seidel's crew talked. They didn't file a report. They didn't make a formal recommendation. They just mentioned it. Told another crew what they'd seen, described the maneuver, the flaps, the turn, the fighter that overshot. Other pilots were skeptical. Some thought it was exaggeration. Combat does strange things to perception. Maybe the fighter was already pulling out. Maybe it misjudged on its own. But a few listened. One of them was a pilot named Ed Hartley, older, 30 missions already. He'd seen too many bombers go down in flames because they couldn't maneuver. If there was even a chance Seidel was onto something, he wanted to know. He found Seidel in the mess hall, sat down across from him, asked him to walk through it, step by step. Seidel did. He explained the logic. Flaps increased lift and drag. Drag slowed you down fast. Lift, combined with back pressure, tightened your turn radius. You didn't need to sustain it, just a few seconds, just enough to make the attacker overshoot or break off. The danger was obvious. Too much flap and you'd stall. Too much speed and you'd buckle the structure. But there was a window, narrow, unforgiving, but real. Hartley thought about it. Then he nodded, said he'd try it if he got the chance. 2 days later, he did. His squadron was hit over Castle. 3 Me-109s punched through the formation, one locked onto Hartley's bomber, came in from 6 o'clock low. Hartley's gunners were firing, but the fighter was good, slipping left and right, closing. Hartley remembered what Seidel had said. He chopped the throttles, dropped the flaps, pulled hard. The bomber shuddered and yawed. The wings flexed, the altimeter unwound. But the nose came around. The fighter shot past, close enough that Hartley could see the blur of the propeller. The 109 didn't come back. Hartley landed with his hands still tingling. He found Seidel that evening, told him it worked, told him he'd just saved 10 men. After that, it wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a tactic. Crews started practicing, carefully, on return flights, alone, away from the formation. They tested the flap settings, the speed thresholds, how much altitude you lost, how fast you could recover. They catalogued it, passed it along. Some crews called it the Seidel Break. Others called it the flap trick. The name didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked. Not every time. The timing had to be perfect. If you dropped flaps too early, the fighter adjusted. Too late, and you were already hit. If you were too slow, you stalled. Too fast, and you risked structural failure. But when it worked, and it started showing up in mission reports. Fighter evasion successful using rapid deceleration and increased angle of attack. No casualties. Aircraft returned to base. The brass noticed. Not immediately, but by late October enough reports had filtered up that someone at group headquarters asked questions. What's this maneuver? Where did it come from? Is it sanctioned? The answer was no. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't part of the training syllabus. It was field innovation, born of necessity and validated by survival. A flight engineer was sent to evaluate it. He watched a demonstration flight, saw the flaps drop, saw the turn, saw the strain on the airframe. He went back and ran the numbers, checked the stress limits, the load factors, the margin for error. His conclusion: it was dangerous. It violated design parameters, but it was within tolerance. Barely. If executed correctly, the structure could handle it. For a few seconds, once, maybe twice per flight. He recommended conditional approval, with restrictions, only in extremis, only by experienced pilots, only at specified altitudes and speeds. By December, it was in the manual, buried in an appendix. Emergency evasive procedures for heavy bombers under fighter attack. Not encouraged, not discouraged, acknowledged. And it spread beyond the 8th Air Force, crews in the 15th, crews in the Pacific. B-24 pilots adapted it. The Liberator had different aerodynamics, different flap mechanics, but the principle held. A stupid idea from a farm kid from Wisconsin had become doctrine. The impact was measurable. By early 1945, loss rates for heavy bombers began to decline. Not dramatically. The air war was still brutal, but the curve shifted. Fewer planes were being lost to fighter attacks in the vulnerable minutes after the bomb run. More were making it home. Intelligence officers tracked it. Debriefings mentioned successful evasions more frequently. Fighter pilots reported bombers behaving unpredictably, braking suddenly, turning harder than expected. It disrupted their attack profiles, made kills harder to secure. German aces noticed it too. Post-war interviews revealed their frustration. The bombers had started doing something new, something that didn't fit their training. One pilot described it as if the bomber suddenly became a glider, slow and tight. By the time you corrected, the angle was gone. Exact numbers are hard to isolate. The air war was chaos. 1,000 variables determined survival: weather, flak density, fighter availability, crew skill, luck. But squadron commanders saw the difference. Planes that should have gone down came back with stories of last-second evasions. Crews that adapted the Seidel Break had better survival odds. Not guaranteed, never guaranteed, but better. The 390th Bomb Group tracked it internally. Over a 3-month period, bombers employing the maneuver had a 15% higher return rate when engaged by fighters outside the formation. 15% doesn't sound like much until you multiply it by hundreds of sorties, thousands of airmen. It also changed tactics on the German side. Fighters started attacking from different angles. Head-on passes increased. Attacks from above and below, where the flap trick was less effective. The Luftwaffe adapted. But adaptation took time, and in that time, men lived who otherwise wouldn't have. By April, the war in Europe was ending. The Luftwaffe was a shadow. Fuel shortages grounded their planes. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. The Seidel Break was no longer needed as desperately, but it had already done its work. It had proven something else, too. That innovation didn't only come from engineers in labs or officers in command posts. It came from the men in the cockpits, the ones who lived with the consequences of every decision, the ones who understood the machines not as diagrams but as living, breathing things made of rivets and will. Seidel never wrote a paper on it, never gave a lecture. He flew his missions, survived the war, went home, but his trick stayed in the manual, stayed in the training, a footnote that saved lives. Harold Seidel returned to Wisconsin in the summer of 1945. He didn't talk much about the war, didn't seek recognition. He went back to the farm, fixed tractors, raised a family, lived quietly in the same landscape he'd left years before. Occasionally, someone would ask him about his service. He'd mention the missions, the cold, the flak. But he rarely mentioned the maneuver. It hadn't felt like heroism to him. It had felt like logic, a problem observed, a solution tested, a result confirmed. That was how he understood the world, not as a place of grand gestures, but as a place where small adjustments could mean everything. Decades later, when aviation historians began documenting tactical innovations of the air war, they found references to the Seidel Break buried in old after-action reports and training updates. They tracked it back to him, asked him about it. He shrugged, said it wasn't just him, said other pilots figured it out too, said he was just the first one stupid enough to try it. But the record shows otherwise. The maneuver bore his fingerprints, his logic, his willingness to see past doctrine when doctrine failed. He died in 1998, 79 years old. No headlines, no ceremonies, just a quiet man who had once flown through fire and found a way to turn when turning was impossible. But the lesson stayed. Innovation in war doesn't always come from the top. It comes from the people who live closest to the problem. The ones who can't afford to wait for permission, the ones who see a machine not as it was designed, but as it could be. Harold Seidel saw that. In the noise and chaos of a bomber under attack, with seconds to live or die, he saw a possibility no one else had imagined, and he pulled the lever.